we are set. And Steve, I just introduced you, so go for it.
Okay, great. Thank you all. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Excellent. So as Kathy was mentioning, I'm in Minneapolis today. We're doing our 6th annual Building Energy and Benchmarking Conference, as well as Energy Codes. Mia's put this on for 6 years now, and it was pretty successful. We've had somewhere between 80 and 100 people come for our 2.5-day event, and we're going to wrap it up today. So I'm, very fortunate that I had all of my presentations on Tuesday, so I'm feeling well rested again and ready to go. So I'm going to give you a little background before I talk about energy data and benchmarking, about the organization I work for, which is the Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance. Looks like this. And I usually ask for audience participation in my presentations, but I think it might be a little hard long distance, so I'm going to have to go on myself. And then you're supposed to laugh. There you go. Good job. Good job. Okay. So that's probably the only participation I'll ask for today. And I made arrangements to, ask some specific questions about my presentation at the end, and then after Raj presents, then we'll do some joint Q&A as well. Okay. So MIA, as we like to call it, or Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, we have a pretty big footprint. So it's bigger than I ever imagined being the Midwest. I'm from Minnesota originally, and grew up there and moved back after school, and then came down to Chicago in 2000, and I've been here, for 15 years. And my background is an architect, and I got into energy efficiency doing that as a sustainable consultant, and then found myself moving to a new job and working for a nonprofit, which MIA is. So that's been kind of fun, and part of my work has been energy codes, and now has moved, well, I guess for the last 4 years has moved into the benchmarking and energy data field. So, MIA, we're all about energy efficiency and moving that along for economic reasons, but also environmental reasons. So here goes our 13 states. We work with a lot of different voices, and our point is to be the source and allow discussion to happen to deliver the programming and policy work that covers everybody and moves the energy efficiency ball along. So some of you might be part of our stakeholder groups already, or you could be part of that. We work with utilities a lot and state governments, local governments, but also manufacturers, academic and research organizations, and those who serve utilities, so the consultants, energy service firms, and other nonprofits as well. So let's get into talking about benchmarking. I also include building energy data because that's more of a generic term. And what is that? I'm going to give some introductory slides as to what that is, so we can, as Raj talks about what's happened and happening in Madison, we're all on the same page and speaking the same language. So benchmarking is really just an energy tracking activity, and it's over time. So you compare the results of that to the building itself. So how did it do this year compared to last year? Or you can compare it to a different standard. So how does my library use energy compared to other libraries in Madison or in the Midwest or nationally? And so there's a variety of tools that work for that. But it can be any building type. So I also note at the bottom, multifamily is also in that ability to compare energy use. So we talk about that in different ways. Analogies that work well is a miles per gallon sticker that EPA has put out for many years, or a kilowatts per ton for cooling equipment. But I also like to highlight lighting efficiency. We used to talk about that in watts, And as you might know, watts is a measure of energy use. But now, fortunately, the way that the packaging has progressed just in the last couple of years is we're talking about lumens per watt, so how much light output, or lumens, is available per energy used. So when we move to buildings then, we're talking about whole building energy use, and that's usually by the year and by a square footage. So, you know, the actual information is kBTUs per square foot per year. You can say that really fast 3 times and then you really know that. But if we compare that back to how cities have goals, that's usually in a CO2 equivalent per square foot per year, or the same as greenhouse gas emissions per year. And that goes along with their greenhouse gas goals. So that's equivalent when we talk about whole building energy use, which is the kBTUs per square foot per year. We can roll that up into a whole city approach, and then that could be greenhouse gas emissions. So there's actually some great benefits that work on the government side, as I mentioned already, but also building owners can reap benefits from benchmarking their energy use, whether it's something that they do themselves and just look internally, or if they share that information through a voluntary program or through an ordinance-based program. So with the energy use that you use in one year, you can then guess, well, next year I'll probably use the same amount of energy, and so that I can create a budget of that amount. And maybe if I do some upgrades or I change the light bulbs out, then I may guess that I'm going to, or I could even measure that I'll save 10% next year, so my budget will then be reduced by 10 years for my energy. It's also a great way to verify if you use an ESCO or energy service company, and they say, well, you know, if you work with us, we'll give you savings equal to 20% next year over the next 5 years, which is impossible because then you'd be, in 5 years, you'd use nothing, right? Mm-hmm. But it's a great way to confirm that the ESCO is actually saving you the amount that they estimated they would in the contract. So you can verify that their savings is accurate. And of course, if you get a LEED certification, you have to submit your energy use information every year for I think it's the first 5 years. And so benchmarking is exactly what that means. For the market then, benchmarking and transparency, or giving that information out, usually with some privacy issues, some privacy surrounding that, but allowing the information to be revealed in the market is a great way for the market to be transformed. Allow different building owners, allow different building owners to understand how their neighbor's doing. And I would say, directly related to something that I talked about with Kathy, that's a great way to inform the market, but also maybe ask for some behavior change happening. So one building owner might say, well, I'm using 100 kBTUs per square foot, and the guy next door says, well, I use 95. That 100 kBTUs per square foot building owner might say, I want to do better than my neighbors, so more people will move to my building, and I can, lease out 100%. So they're hopefully, and we haven't proven that yet in the market that I know of, it's a great way to enhance behavior changes and move the market towards a more sustainable and enriched environment. So another benefit, we have some confirmation that benchmarking does save some energy. EPA did this study in 2012 of buildings who had already submitted information using Portfolio Manager. And I should say that Portfolio Manager is the tool that's free that EPA created to allow buildings to benchmark. And that's, nearly all building types. There's some that are not available to get the 1 to 100 score, but they can track their energy. I don't know if I put the score So I'll get back to the score later. But nonetheless, the point is that basically over a 3-year period, each year you can save 2% just by alone tracking your energy. And over 3 years, that would be a 7% reduction. So it's amazing, just by tracking the energy you use, you can create savings. So that on the bottom right then, the 6-point score increase is that 1 to 100 score that I slightly mentioned. So Portfolio Manager, the tool, has a 1 to 100 score, and 100 is the best, 1 is the worst. And so where you fall in the line just compares your building to the national average. And moving up is increasing the energy efficiency of your building. And so we can talk more about the Energy Star score later if you all would like to do that. So this is something that is having national importance. It's spread around the country, but it is still a new idea. You can see New York passed the first ordinance in the U.S. in 2009. If we look internationally, Europe and Australia have been doing that a lot longer, maybe 10 years longer. So they have a more mature market, and that disclosure to the public as well as to building owners is much more transparent and readily happening. So when there's a building coming up, they're constructing a new building, and there's the construction fence around that to make sure nobody falls into the hole where the building will rise out of the ground. They'll actually put on the construction fence the estimated score that the building will receive once it's done. So we haven't got that far yet in the U.S., but we're moving in that direction to have that score or that label be shown off. So there's a variety of different building types that are under these policies. You can see oftentimes it includes municipal and commercial buildings. Sometimes it includes multifamily. It depends. And usually it includes public disclosure to allow that comparison to happen between building owners in a public database or a public, basically, spreadsheet. So in the Midwest, we have 3 cities who have passed benchmarking ordinances. Minneapolis was the first in 2013. Chicago followed quickly behind. And Kansas City recently passed, earlier this year, ordinance as well. So we have 3. They get and make them golden stars. I made them blue stars here. You can see that I'm still suggesting that Madison is considering legislation. That's gone through for a number, I say 2 years or so. Raj will talk more about that process. I've been involved in all 3 of these cities who've passed ordinances as well as Madison. And also a smaller city that's a suburb of Chicago called Evanston. It's on the north side of Chicago. They're about 50,000 in population. They're currently considering legislation. And I would say they're maybe halfway through the process, which for them is going to be about a year and a half to go through that. So it's not unusual that, and I would say not unusual that policies or ordinances take a while to happen. In the lightning bolts, there's challenge programs or voluntary programs happening in Columbus, Ohio, St. Louis, Missouri, and then also in Michigan, it's becoming a statewide challenge program that USGBC in both Rapid City and Detroit is running. And then you can see there's some states in the green and orange color that are also tracking their energy use of public buildings. So in the Midwest, actually, we're pretty good about that. There's lots of tracking happening in the green, and in the oranges, states who have done a pilot, who've tracked their energy for a year or longer. And I would say that Iowa might be the next to change to green because they're really interested in this. They put in a lot of effort into getting all their public buildings under a tracking mechanism. So the other key thing that makes these policies happen, I would say efficiently for building owners, is the ability to move the energy data from the utility. So instead of just getting a paper bill that says what your energy use is each month, that it becomes an electronic process and that information can move more directly or more easily from the utility directly to the building owner. And then the building owner can move that information to either a disclosure program, which would be an ordinance or a challenge program, or also to their tool, so that there's not a loss in data because people are trying to copy the information from a paper bill to an electronic tool, or there's some miscommunication along the way. So that's something that's happened throughout the country, but not for a lot of utilities. Usually electric utilities are the first to do that, and the gas or natural gas utilities follow close behind. But it's not essential. It is certainly a great thing. For instance, Chicago has the electronic movement of data from the electric utility ComEd, but People's Gas is a little slower behind. They have the ability to send a spreadsheet versus moving the data directly to a tool, such as Portfolio Manager. So I mentioned a little bit that there's two different types of policies, ordinance-based approach versus a voluntary. So there are lots of similarities. Unfortunately, voluntary programs usually only include about 10 to 20% of the building population, and the idea of these types of policies to have the city be able to understand what is the total energy use of the city, all of the buildings, and that can then assist the city in understanding what is the energy use of the buildings plus my transportation, and how does that meet up with my greenhouse gas goals. So a voluntary program doesn't allow a city to do that. They get a partial view, but not the whole idea. And of course, with a voluntary program, that 10 and 20% doesn't really influence a large population of buildings. It can happen behind the scenes, but the projection of buildings moving in a more efficient direction really isn't shown through the media or by the city itself as they disclose that information, typically on a yearly basis. That disclosure can happen. So imagine a disclosure process could include the address of the building and the annual energy use, and then the kBTUs per square foot per year, which is called the EUI. That is the only information that is typically seen. So it's quite a small amount of information that's available to the public, but just enough to garner some influence. So there is some voluntary programs that have been successful. I'm not sure if, I don't think that Madison has a BOMA, Building Owners and Managers Association, but they've done something that's called a kilowatt crackdown, and they've had some success with that. It usually lasts a year. It's a great way to gather the organizations who work together on buildings, but it's not a long-term idea. The Better Buildings Challenge is one that the Department of Energy, federal folks, have put together. That's actually that's been going for 3 years, and that's going to sunset for some of the programs next year. So that's also a temporary thing. And so there's some other scoring tools that bring out a label or like a A to, well, in this graphic, a A to G, which is often a A to E or A to F rating to show how well the building's performing. So there's some goals, and usually it's a 12-month submission of data. We're going to roll down to the last bit, and that's who's responsible for meeting these ordinances, and that's the property owner themselves and not the tenants. the responsibility is for the property owner to gather all the information from all the energy uses in the building and roll that up into a monthly energy use and submit annual energy use to the governing body. So it's there is some effort, but actually it doesn't take that much. I've done quite a bit of benchmarking actually for a pilot I did for the state of Illinois, and after doing a few buildings, it took me about 10 hours to do for a annual energy submission. So not too bad actually. And as I mentioned, there's some great benefits like, okay, you understand how much energy you use, now you can create a budget for that energy use. So here's some repeats of what I had said before, I guess. So the EUI is the energy use intensity. That's the annual energy use, and we measure that in kBTUs per square foot per year. It is a whole building idea, so it includes all the different energy types. So yes, natural gas and electricity. If there's other energy uses, in the East Coast they do a lot more oil, but if you're using wood or other types of combustibles, you would include that in your energy consumption amount. In addition to energy itself, water use can also be tracked, and that's usually measured in gallons, and that's a monthly basis. So that's another thing to also measure, and a great way to understand how much is used in the building, and of course that relates directly to energy use itself, moving that water through the building, and if we look more extensively, also moving that water and that sewage throughout the city itself. So just tracking energy and water is the typical measurement that happens for either voluntary programs or ordinance-based programs. Beyond that, one city, New York City, decided to do additional things to, I would say, in my opinion, ensure that energy savings happened. So on a 10-year basis, or I should say first, on a 3-year basis, they're requiring buildings to do an energy audit. To do it, and if you know about those, ASHRAE Level 2 version, which means a person walks through the building, usually takes about 10 hours, looks at all the energy-consuming devices. So easy to think about a home, that's the furnace, the water heater, and measure and visually inspects how they're doing, if there's insulation around those devices, is there insulation in the ductwork, is something look faulty, or is there something that could be improved, makes a list of possible measures that could be improved on, and then gives that to the building owner. New York City wanted that to happen so that there could be an additional review for the building owner of what could happen and allow that building owner to make those improvements. There isn't any requirement for the building owner to do that. However, the next two are required. So every 10 years, then lighting upgrades should happen. And New York City is mainly for commercial buildings or very large residential buildings. So that's something that they foresee as, well, lighting changes all the time. We used to have T12 fluorescent lighting. It moved to T8s, and now T5s are readily available. So the number is measuring how wide the diameter of the bulb is. And that's changed quite frequent in the last few years, or I say the last 20 years. And now we have LEDs that can replace fluorescent bulbs or compact fluorescence even. So that we don't see a change in that movement happening. That's going to continue. So as we get more efficient, every 10 years, a lighting upgrade kind of makes sense. And they also include retro-commissioning, so that's a way to take the basic first measure of an audit, and that's to make sure that the building systems are running as they are intended. So is the circulation system plugged up by something, or is it able to flow as it was intended when it was designed? That's a basic idea of it. So I'm just going to move down to, actually I'm getting pretty close to the end of this, so I'm going to move down to number 6, because this is the interesting part, I think, for you all. Yes, the ordinance has to happen. There's a great idea to have a stakeholder group. You make the legislation, you implement that legislation. But as I've heard more and more, the way that any policy is successful is what is the supporting information for that. So, information or actions that happen. I'll talk about Chicago because it's more fresh in my mind, I guess, and I've been involved in some of these actions. So, having a class to say how to use the tool, and they selected Energy Star Portfolio Manager because of the free tool. And doing those classes, they brought outreach to the building owners and managers. They created some documentation to show how to move through the submission process, what's needed to do that. Create a FAQ. They also create a hotline that people can call in and ask questions about how their submission's going. And then they're following up with a challenge program, so to help move the ball or entice people to make some changes with their energy use. And that challenge program then says is kind of behavior change. So you can voluntarily enroll in the program, and we're going to ask you to save 20% of your energy use in 10 years. And you can do that however you'd like to, but we're giving you the supporting process and linking that with the utility rebate program so you can see if you make a 10% savings, the utility will give you back 20 or 50% of that cost. So it's a great way to, with all policies, there is some support, and benchmarking programs, we've seen, if they are successful, they include all of these components. So I talked a lot about the behavior change idea within benchmarking. It's an engagement process with building owners and the city, but there's also some tenant involvement as well. It's especially helpful to have that tenant involvement, whether it's a commercial building or a multifamily building, because the energy consumption measurement is for all the building uses. So if the tenants have their own meter, that's included in the whole building energy use. The interesting thing is that building-to-building comparison, if the information is available on a public website, then people can look at it. But we don't know, actually, if this works, and I'm being honest, we don't know if this works as successfully as it is intended, or how well does it work. There's a few studies that are out there that show that it does work, but I'm one to want to have concrete information that it certainly works, and the savings is X%. So I'm asking you all if you know any studies that potentially could relate to this or actually have been done on benchmarking programs. We can see how it works. We understand how voluntary programs do show change of savings, change of energy use, and real savings happening. Is it potential for all buildings within a city? Certainly. Does it happen? I don't have the percentage of buildings that actually make that change, and that's because these programs are really a little young in their process. Oftentimes they're a phased-in approach, that the larger buildings submit their information first, and so in the Midwest we've only seen that three-phase approach happen in one city. In Minneapolis, Chicago has a four-step approach, so they're going to do their last phase next year, and Kansas City is just out of the gates, and they just passed their ordinance, so they haven't even implemented the first version yet. So certainly would like to hear some discussion in the audience about how behavior can influence energy use as we go on. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.
So are there quick clarifying questions for Steve before we have keeping discussion questions and maybe energy savings for the end? No?
So on the automatic data sharing from the utility straight to some kind of tool, part of what's needed here is the building size. Where does that come from in that flow?
So the question was part of the data sharing and moving that directly to the tool. One of the things that's needed is the building size. Where does that come from? Where can people get that?
Oh, for a building owner, the size of the building is available in multiple places. So you can, if you need to physically measure it, it's the outside of the building. And you can use a tape measure to do that, yes. But that's the manual approach. In addition, if you have the drawings of the building from when it was originally constructed, that's always there. And it's a volume, so square footage, you have to add each floor together for the total square footage. Sometimes the
Did I miss it?
So I think the question, I think maybe Ingo's question was actually where that if the utility data is coming automatically from the utility, where's that size? And I think the answer is the owner has to enter that.
Oh, so let's say one other sentence about that. Okay.
Yeah.
So I didn't include that. I'd like to break it down that there's two pieces of information that need to be collected in order to benchmark. One is the energy data that comes from the utility. The other is something I would term the base building information. So Portfolio Manager, like other tools, requires you to have, yes, the square footage of the building, what the building type is, and then some other characteristics. So is it just one type of occupancy? And I'll use this same example I had before. Is it just a library, or is the library connected to the City Hall, and so that there would be two uses within the building? And then some basic information of how many computers are used in the building. Is there any laundry facilities? Is there any refrigeration equipment? And it's a pretty short list, probably about 20 data points. So that's not too bad.
There are those. Okay, then I think thank you very much, Steve. If you can stay on the line there.
Yep, and so if you would give the sharing role and back to me.
Right, and then we're going to hear from Raj about where we're at in Madison.
There we go. Share this.
Hey, Steve, how are you?
Good.
Hi, everybody. Can I sit, or do you want me to turn? Okay.
So which is yours, the new...
No slides.
No slides.
Oh, okay. Wow, awesome.
Things up a little bit. So my name is Raj Shukla. I'm the chair of the Sustainable Madison Committee. As you know, many of you know, I work with Kathy at Cool Choices as well. Sort of setting the stage here. Before, I'm going to talk about where we started on this process, and thankfully Jeanette Ladach is on our committee, can help fill in some gaps too. Start where we started, move to where we ultimately are, where we are today, but before we get there, I want to just sort of do a little review. So does everyone remember here what Steve mentioned as what are the possible benefits of benchmarking? Why are and I think all of us kind of know them. Let's just shout them out. Somebody.
Money.
Money. To save money. Cost savings for tenants or for building owners.
City to get its arms around its emissions.
So we can get a better sense of what emissions are and get a better sense of where we should target interventions. So that's the second one.
More accurate budget.
What's that?
More accurate budget?
More accurate budget, so I put that in the money pile, yeah, absolutely.
Easier to compete for good tenants.
Easier to compete for good tenants. So this is sort of the market transformation side of it, right? So those are the three big elements. So why don't we, I want to go from there to what do you guess are the three big areas of pushback that we would hear from building owners, from businesses?
Data privacy.
Data privacy.
Costs too much.
Costs too much.
Too much work.
Too much work.
Split between needed benefit.
Split between who pays and who benefits. So it's a lot of sort of cost-related stuff, and
I don't want the government to tell me what to do.
I do not want the government to tell me what to do, right? Okay, so I'm going to add another one, which we learned the hard way in this process. And I think, I'm not going to speak for Jeanette, she's here, she can talk for herself. I'm guessing she saw the same stuff, though. Relationships. There isn't necessarily always a strong relationship between policymakers who have a great idea for an intervention and business people who maybe don't understand what the policy objective is or don't trust the people implementing the policy, right? So, or don't care, but I think it's actually less that they don't care and more that they don't know and don't know how they're going to work with people to make this real without hurting their business, okay? So we started on this path, I think, 2013, and we started by proposing a mandatory energy benchmarking program in Madison, only dealing with commercial and municipal buildings. I don't think that targeted multifamily in particular, and I think it was, they still hadn't decided this, and this is still an area of discussion, but it was around 50,000 square feet of building size and up, right? Mandatory. So every building would have to do this. Every building would have to enter this data, and you know, all of the benefits that we hope would happen. And that's another part of this equation. This is all theoretical, theoretical benefits, right? And Steve mentioned this, and so we don't know exactly what the benefits are going to be. There's a really young program. And when you're asking a business person to invest in something, even if the investment is relatively small, all things considered, and you can't tell them what the ROI is, the immediate question is like, wait a second, my business is not energy efficiency. My business is X, 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 and X. Often we didn't have an answer to that, and that's a real concern. But we started with a mandatory program. Our alder on our committee went out there and pushed a mandatory program, and it failed. And it failed pretty spectacularly. We couldn't get businesses to sign up or to be champions for this program, and it failed. So we went back to the drawing board. The city council said, okay, we're going to create an ad hoc committee to sort out the differences here between the business community, between the activist organizations, and between the city administrators who'd be doing this project itself. And that added another, year and a half to the process, 6, 7 meetings, monthly meetings, and then additional, a small working group of property owners, sort of technical experts around various issues here to try and work out an agreement. How could we get there? In the process, we learned about the differences between mandatory and voluntary programs. The biggest one being, in a voluntary program, I actually think, Steve, you might have, we'll have to go back to the data. I think Steve actually overstated the success of voluntary programs. I think what we saw was those communities that had started with a voluntary program got about 5 to 7% of buildings participating. Whereas a mandatory program, you're in the 90s, right? Very easy to understand why that might happen. But there's some big differences there. That's ultimately where we got to, because the business community couldn't get over a couple of things. Data security, that was a big one, Sassy mentioned right away. Data security right away, and then the one that I mentioned, which is just trust, relationships. The business community did not trust implementers to do this well, to do it in a way that was sensitive to their concerns about privacy of information, about whether or not, a friendly competition where we, showcase the building's energies, whether that wasn't just going to be used to bludgeon building owners who are in old facilities, maybe doing the best they can, but So there were a lot of fears there, and I think a lot of it was born, this is my opinion, Jeanette, I'd love your thoughts on this. A lot of this was born from our approach. We went straight to, we are going to do a mandatory program because climate change is really important, we have to deal with it. And the business community was like, okay, we agree that climate change is important, but like, why are we the only people that are being signaled out here to deal with this? One, for a program that you don't have a demonstrated impact from yet, even though there are indications. And three, you started with a mandatory program. You started with the discussion on we are going to force you to do something without laying a foundation for we're going to do this together.
The word that keeps coming to my head when I remember the process is that the business community felt blindsided because they, all of a sudden there was this mandatory proposal on the table and there was no conversation.
So let me give you a little context to that. So just to underscore what Jeanette's saying. I think it might have been that same year, 2013, it might have been the year prior. Madison passed a mandatory ordinance to ban the box on job applications. Do y'all know what this is? So it's basically banning the use of somebody's past criminal history in a job application process. So someone does not have to say, I have a criminal history on their job application. Because there's a lot of indication that that's being used to discriminate against people. And now the president has now just advocated the same approach. We should not be stigmatizing folks. That was a mandatory program. That would have added costs to a business's HR process. It would have added work to people that have to go back and change forms and things like that. But it went through, and it went through with the support of the business community because they were engaged in the conversation from the beginning. And it was actually discussed. How can we implement this in a way that's not going to burden you too much and in a way that's going to achieve our goal? So we learned a lot, I think, to get to a point where, from my perspective as sort of an energy professional, this is like a suboptimal endpoint, right? We have a voluntary, so where we are right now, a voluntary resolution, buildings above 50,000 square feet will input their information, and all the benefits of this will become apparent. But a key part of the process, and this is something we built into the discussion and built into the process, is that we will spend time building relationships, educating the business community about this, and making this something they want to participate in instead of something that they have to participate in. That's the goal. That's a hard thing to do. And it'll be more expensive in some ways for the city to implement something like that. But here's the benefit. And this is why we ultimately, as a committee, decided to push forward on this, despite the clear limitations of this approach. The business community, and by that I mean the Chamber of Commerce, Downtown Madison Inc., Smart Growth Madison, all put their names on this resolution and committed to getting 90% of the buildings that are in this target signed up within 4 years, I think by 2020. That's a really ambitious goal for a voluntary program, and it has never been done before anywhere in the country. The only way we are going to be able to do it is with the business community going out, pounding the pavement, getting their members to be a part of it. And they're committed to doing it in a very public way. That's a pretty dramatic change from the opposition that we saw to this ordinance in 2013, 2014. So, I mean, what I want you all to walk away from today after this discussion is a couple of things. Benchmarking is a good idea to try, absolutely. And we don't know everything about it, but it is a good thing to try and explore. We need to understand where energy use is happening, where emissions are coming from, and where to target intervention. But it isn't just an engineering question. It isn't just a question of how to most efficiently transfer information from here to there. A lot of it is a lot softer, and it's a lot harder to do. It's building relationships with the people that are going to be affected by this in order to move the process forward. So here's where we are now. We have the business community as well as the city completely behind a benchmarking effort. We have really, really aggressive goals to try and reach and that they signed on to. And we have a commitment to try and shift the culture of the business community around this city to one that actually embraces talking about their energy use, talking about the successes that they've made, and talking about the improvements that they want to make. We, I think, have successfully changed this conversation from something that felt like something punitive to businesses, oh man, they're going to shame me, to how can we celebrate the work that you're doing around energy efficiency? How can we figure out how to do that? And one step here is you just committing to measuring. That's it. That's all we're doing. A couple of differences between what we're doing and some of the other ordinances that have been passed. And to be clear, what we did was not an ordinance. It was a resolution that just signified a joint effort. We did not force anybody to do anything. That's why it's not an ordinance. There is no public disclosure of the data, not initially. From our perspective, it was really important to get businesses bought into the concept that we're not going to use this information to beat you over the head and tell you don't like the environment, which was very clearly what the business community was telling us they were scared of, right? So no public disclosure initially, voluntary, the second thing, and there is no automatic link up between MG&E's, most largely MG&E's data set and what we would have to do. Wisconsin has some quirky sort of public disclosure, not quirky, they're just unique public disclosure requirements from any information the city gets from a business is subject to open records review. That was something that really put a lot of businesses kind of on edge about this. And they didn't want information leaking out to the public that they felt competitors could use or whatever. So there's no public disclosure. We don't get the efficiencies of a direct link, but I think we can get around that in some other ways. And what we know for sure is that it's something that Steve mentioned, that last slide, number 6. Training and building a community around this where people feel free to ask questions, people learn information from their peers, and we build a sort of culture around this stuff is a really integral part of this, at least in Madison, at least right now. We aren't, it turns out, like a lot of other cities in a lot of different ways, but in some unexpected ways. You know, I think we went into this, maybe Jeanette, all of us thinking like, this is Madison. Of course we're going to do this, right? It's a different world than maybe the one that's in our head, right? So, you know, from my perspective, it's a victory in that the business community is engaged, and they weren't before. Engaged in this topic where you have, you know, the president of the Chamber of Commerce coming to constant meetings about this. That's a pretty big departure than what we've seen earlier. And I think it's largely due to the commitment of Jeanette and the others on the committee who made a point of trying to build an actual relationship instead of shove a policy solution down a group of folks' throats. So, that's all I've got to say about it. I'll take questions.
What has MG&E's response been about that direct link? And it strikes me as being in contrast to what I think is great on the residential side of the MG&E business, where you can actually go to the website and look at any home's usage, which is phenomenal compared to most cities. So, what's that discussion been like?
MG&E is very guarded about its customer information, and for a whole host of reasons, and a lot of them are really good. I understand why. They have not offered to create some kind of link. I think that what we want to do to help persuade them is actually have a group of businesses that go through this process for 1 year and advocate to MG&E instead of us asking them to do something like this. I think with the support of the business community, they'll be much more interested in figuring out a way to do that. But for right now, you know, you can get the information you want in a non-automated way. It does add cost and add time and add inefficiencies to the process, but I think in order to build the case for doing this, We just have to go that route.
And I think that it's a technology issue for them, because if, there's those green button solutions where you connect the utility data to Portfolio Manager, and I think MG&E was wary, like Raj said, of promising that, or they didn't know what that would entail, so they didn't want to say, they would be doing it. But I think because, I think there's a host of other utilities around the country with the same, that are doing the green button transfer, and I think it's a question of them not knowing, so therefore they didn't want to promise.
Right.
And
I do think also that the community conversations that are going on at MG&E is sponsoring around it's the way it wants to conduct itself in the future is another opportunity to address just that. So I think there is a discussion that they're willing to have.
For utilities, there are a lot of issues that are bundled into doing something like that. There's the legal issues of privacy, there's risk of non-performance, what if the system doesn't work, what if the data is wrong, the public reaction, any number, stakeholder reaction, shareholder reaction for the IOUs. And so they have to be able to unravel those issues to their satisfaction. And I think, maybe if developing that trust and relationships, that they have to develop that with their customers as well. But if the customers demand it, that's going to go a long way in encouraging the utilities to do it.
Yeah, I would say that in every place that I've worked, the key word is what I think Kathy just said, the demand. The utility has to understand that there's going to be a lot of people demanding that they would like their energy use for their building, the data summarized into a digestible platform or packet. And until they understand that, they're not willing to make the investment, whether that's a financial investment or a policy investment within their own process. And so I think it is a smart way to go about doing that for a voluntary program for the first year, and then you can have the businesses be behind you and say, we are making this demand, we need this information, it's too much work for us not to have this be automated.
So, Raj, one intriguing thing Tracy.
Powder.
Okay. One intriguing thing that I think you said, Raj, is that by building trust and working with the business community, you've got them interested in not just the benchmarking, but they're also thinking about energy in ways that they might not have been without that conversation. I'd be interested in whether you're doing anything to track that, document it, maybe do a case study on showing that evolution and recording it and then sharing what happens and how that all evolves.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's exactly hitting on what you're saying, but I think a big part of what we think is going to convince the business community to participate is hearing stories from the business community about their evolution of it. Understanding that, at first I was really weary, but now, having gone through this, it's not a big deal. It's the kind of thing that Cool Choices does with individuals, this isn't as hard as you think, and suddenly we let them do the marketing for sustainability, right? We don't have to do as much. That's kind of the approach that we want to take here as well. They're our best advocates if we can convince them. Phil?
I'm curious, so a few months back, after several years of push, Congress passed the commercial energy efficiency bill that Gene Shaheen and Rob Portman had been trying to get to for a while, and includes some incentives for energy efficiency, tenant star labeling for particularly efficient tenants, but it's still a voluntary thing. I'm curious if something like that, it's generally targeted towards energy efficiency and not benchmarking, but I wonder if something like that with incentives built in could also help push businesses along towards
I think that's the
being
path.
comfortable with
I mean,
that.
provided that, and something that can be clear is like, and this is something that we kind of assumed, but it wasn't said in the initial process, but provided that we can make any kind of competitive effort like full of warm fuzzies and cheering and not shaming. And which I think we can do. I don't think that's a hard thing, but I think a lot of businesses really thought, oh, I don't want this to turn into, you know, we've got Mr. Yuck stickers on, and do you guys remember Mr. Yuck? Mr. Yuck stickers on some buildings and smiley faces on other, and that's not what we're intending. So I think your point's well taken. That's kind of how we want to structure.
I think also the sentiment, just to hark back to that, there's another sentiment, competing sentiment about how the business community felt like in the initial process, the initial mandatory resolution, they said, they were saying, you know, it's our business. We know what's best for our business. So yeah, we may work in multiple things in our business, not energy efficiency. Our business is optimizing our business. And we should know what's best for our business. And so you're telling me I'm not doing what's best for my business? I don't believe that, you know, or why are you critiquing something that I think I should know? So there was a sentiment that they felt like they were being critiqued without reason. Right. They should already know how to optimize their business, and energy is one piece of that.
Right.
Even though they may not be. You know, they may not know exactly how their energy is doing compared to other buildings, but they still felt like they should have a handle on it.
And I think one preliminary conversation could have dispelled a lot of that. Yeah. But that's not how it works.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, is there any effort, either in Madison or the other MEA places where this is happening, to include an evaluation component within the legislation such that, you know, you're designing a program that can be easily evaluated? So when you go other places or when you're looking back on it to determine what are the actual savings, and additionally, what are the mechanisms you're talking about to drive those savings? You know, is it actually the benchmarking, or is it that the community has come together and is talking about energy so much that you don't even actually need that benchmarking tool? So if you design that from the beginning, you might be able to see some of those results a couple of years in.
Yeah, and there is absolutely
Did you hear that, Steve?
Within to try and judge a variety of different metrics, just from participation to the types of chatter that we develop to the actual energy savings. And so many of the details of that have to be worked out. Given that Jeanette and I are on the committee, I guarantee that some evaluation component is going to be a part of it. But to what extent, what exactly that means, we don't know.
And just to interest you there, Steve had asked if there are evaluations out there. I was on a webinar the other day where Balloon talked about EPA data that benchmarking yields like 1.5%. My impression in the way Amanda talked about that was kind of classic federal government evaluation. So there's a number, but there's not probably it wouldn't meet your rigorous definition.
She doesn't seem to have a lot of faith in any of her actual numbers.
Yeah, she's right. There's a skepticism, but it seemed deeper about the EPA number that about how they got to that. My guess is they're actually looking at how over time people's reports are changing, and so they're saying, oh,
I think
but there's a lot of
self-selection
self-selection
diminishing by 6 months or a year as well. So understanding the mechanisms that drive that in the first place might be one of the ways that
I think given that, and Raj kind of mentioned it, but given that this process, we're rolling it out right now, we're in the phases for all intents and purposes of deciding how to make an effective program, I think incorporating some of these evaluation techniques in the beginning is really...
You can do it at the beginning, then you can get actual...
Yeah, and I'm kind of thinking about, you know, there's the KBTU number that we want. We want the EUI, but we also want these other metrics. We want to know what they're doing for savings, if they're planning on investing anything. I mean, there's a lot of... There's a soft evaluation, and we want to know process-wise how it's working, but we also want to know, you know, where the savings are. And how effective they are.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, you know, we'll have a very limited data set initially, and we'll only get to, theoretically, if we're really, really successful and all of that in 4 years, we'll have a better sense of exactly how successful things are, but that's how it is, yeah.
Oh, I'd like to make a comment.
Oh, no, go ahead, Steve.
I think this is a great discussion because I'd say the standard benchmarking program just asks the building owners to submit what their annual energy use is, and they don't have any way to follow up to see what changes have been made in the building. And maybe the first year of voluntary approach in Madison could also include, a way to have the building owners report what changes they've made. And so that if this would move to a ordinance-based approach, then there could be that same process happen. So you could inevitably just understand what changes have happened and see if that shows up in the evolution of their annual energy use. I haven't seen that anywhere, and that would really, I think, improve this policy not only for Madison, but as they evolve, as any city has these evolve. I haven't seen anyone bake that in yet. New York City, makes that requirement to happen because they thought that was the only way that they could track the changes that occurred, is by making it a mandatory reporting of, have you done this audit, have you changed your light fixtures out, have you done retro commissioning. So it's a fine line to walk, but I think it's one certainly worth exploring and how you approach the building owners to tell you that data.
Yes. So I'm curious because in a lot of cases when you have a commercial space, sometimes you do have, the tenants are a big part of the communications that may be happening. And I'm curious, in the conversations that you guys are having in Madison, are a lot of the people you're talking to actual building owners, or is there a role or a place in those conversations for the tenants of these buildings that maybe are the actual businesses that are occupying these spaces, or are you guys talking mainly to the people who own and operate the buildings that maybe have more skin in the game when it comes to the utility bills and the general operations of the space itself?
I mean, as far as, who's going to enter the data kind of thing, it's mostly going to be the building owners and operators, that kind of thing. That said, we're going to need the participation of tenant organizations and actual occupants. We'll need their support to prove to the building owners and operators that this is something that they want. It's like you can't just convince someone to do something if they don't think they have to do it. And I think building demand, something Tracy alluded to in a different context earlier, the same thing applies in a commercial space where you have multiple tenants and a whole lot of occupants. They need to be hearing from those folks that this is important to them and that they value it. And we